The clock read 6 in the morning when Daniel opened his eyes. The white ceiling of the room seemed emptier than ever, and the silence around him weighed like a burden. He stretched his arm on the bed, as he did every morning, but found only the cold, empty space beside him. Helena was not there. In fact, she had not been there for weeks. Ever since his wife passed away, each day seemed like an impossible burden to bear. The pain of her absence was a constant shadow, and the house seemed to have lost its color. Before, Helena filled the space with her laughter, her energy, her loving way of remembering the little things of everyday life. Now, only memories remained. He sat on the edge of the bed, rubbing his face with his hands. He knew he needed to get up, but for what? Every corner of that house was a painful reminder that his wife would not return. The picture frames on the shelf, her clothes still folded in the closet, the soft perfume that seemed to have impregnated the pillow. Everything made her absence seem even more unbearable. Walking slowly to the kitchen, Daniel opened the refrigerator but closed it right away. His appetite had disappeared since the day of the funeral. He grabbed a glass of water, but his hand was shaking as he lifted it to his mouth. He looked at the table and saw a pile of envelopes lying there. Ever since Helena left, he no longer had the patience to open letters or take care of anything in the outside world. Bills were piling up. Packages were piling up at the door. Nothing seemed to matter. Without thinking much, he grabbed his jacket and left. He walked through the empty streets to the cemetery. That had become his routine. Every morning, he sat in front of Helena's grave and talked to her, as if she could still hear him. "I would give anything to have you back," he whispered, holding a white rose. The tears came before he could hold them back. The truth was, he didn't know how to go on living without her. Daniel sat there, on the cold cemetery floor, looking at Helena's headstone as if he hoped that, somehow, she would answer. But all there was silence. The wind rustled the leaves of the trees around them, and the smell of the wet earth mixed with the scent of the flowers he left there every morning. He closed his eyes and allowed his mind to go back in time. 5 months ago, everything still seemed normal. Helena was there, by his side, full of life. He remembered exactly the moment when everything changed. That morning, she woke up complaining of a strange tiredness. She said her legs felt weak and her hands were shaking. At first, Daniel didn't pay much attention to it. He thought it was just one of those bad days, the result of a tiring work routine and lack of rest. But as the days went by, the symptoms got worse. When they finally went to the doctor, the diagnosis hit them like a thunderbolt. A rare, mysterious disease with no explanation. The specialist talked about tests, treatments, and probabilities, but Daniel could only look at Helena and see the fear in her eyes. "I don't want to spend the rest of my days in hospitals, Daniel," she said when they left the appointment. "If my time is running out, I want to make the most of it with you." That's how they decided to live the following months to the fullest. They traveled to places they had always dreamed of visiting. They had dinner under the starry sky, walked hand in hand at sunset, laughed at silly jokes, and made plans as if tomorrow was guaranteed. But behind Helena's smile, there was something that Daniel couldn't explain. In the moments of silence, she seemed thoughtful, worried, as if she wanted to say something but didn't know how. Now, sitting in front of her grave, he wondered, what was it that Helena wanted to tell him so much? The days after Helena's death were a blur in Daniel's life. Time seemed to drag on, but at the same time, everything passed too quickly. He barely remembered the funeral, only the weight on his chest and the empty words of people trying to comfort him. The truth was that nothing could fill the void that Helena left. Every morning, he woke up expecting to hear her voice calling him, but all that was left was silence. The house, once full of life, seemed abandoned. He had stopped caring about the simplest things. Dirty dishes piled up in the sink. Mail was thrown on the table. and the curtains remained closed all day, plunging the room into constant darkness. His only refuge was the cemetery. Every day, without exception, he went there, sat in front of Helena's tombstone, and poured out his heart in words. "I don't know what to do anymore. Helena," he whispered one cold morning, holding a white rose, her favorite flower. "Tell me how to move on. Tell me what to do." But she never answered. The grief was suffocating, and the pain grew more and more. The worst thing was the feeling of not having done what was right. Enough. He relived every moment of the last few months, trying to find something that could have changed Helena's fate. Could he have insisted on another treatment? Could he have tried something different? Could she have suffered more than she let on? The nights were even worse. Lying in the empty bed, Daniel tossed and turned, fighting the sleep that never came. When he finally fell asleep, he dreamed of Helena. In the dream, she smiled at him, as if she were alive, and everything went back to the way it was before. But then he woke up, and reality hit him like a blow. On one of those nights, exhausted from crying so much, Daniel whispered in the dark, "If only I could hear your voice one more time." He didn't know that this wish was about to come true. That morning, Daniel woke up to a different noise. Someone was knocking on the door. He frowned, trying to remember if he was expecting anyone. Of course not. Ever since Helena's death, he had avoided any visitors as much as possible. The knocking persisted. With a heavy sigh, he got up, his body feeling tired from the interrupted sleep. He walked to the door, and when he opened it, he found Laura, his mother-in-law, standing there, holding a bag and looking at him with a worried expression. "Daniel, can we talk?" He hesitated. He didn't want to talk. He didn't want anyone to see him in that state. But he didn't have the energy to argue. He just stepped aside and let her in. Laura looked around, and her expression became even more worried. The house was a mess. Dirty dishes in the sink, clothes thrown on the couch, curtains closed, and a pile of mail piled up on the table. "My God, Daniel, are you living like this?" He shrugged. "I just don't see much point in tidying things up." Laura sighed and walked to the kitchen, starting to organize the space without saying anything else. He wanted to protest, but deep down, he knew she just wanted to help. As she washed the dishes, she spoke softly. "I know it hurts. I lost my daughter too, but you have to try to move on." Daniel lowered his head, feeling a lump in his throat. "I don't know how to do this." Laura watched him for a moment, then walked over to the desk, picking up the stack of mail. "Did you even open these letters?" He shook his head. "None of that matters now." She sighed and began to sort through the envelopes, separating bills, flyers, and packages. Then she stopped suddenly, holding a different envelope. "Daniel, this looks like a letter." He frowned. Laura held the envelope out to him. Her name was handwritten in a delicate script that he would recognize anywhere. His heart raced. It was Helena's handwriting. Daniel stood still, staring at the envelope in Laura's hands. His name was there, written in Helena's soft handwriting, as if she were still alive, leaving him some kind of note. His fingers trembled as he picked up the letter. He swallowed hard. "How is that possible? Where did you find this?" His voice was hoarse. "It was here, among the mail. Maybe it arrived days ago, but you didn't notice," Laura replied with a gentle look, realizing the impact that envelope had on him. Daniel felt his legs wobble and sat down on the nearest chair. He ran his fingers over the paper, as if touching it would bring Helena back. His heart was beating fast, and a million questions were forming in his mind. Why would she have written this before she left? What did she want to tell him? Laura crouched down beside him and touched his hand affectionately. "Do you want me to stay with you while you read it?" He shook his head. "I need to do it alone." She nodded, understanding. "Okay, I'll be in the kitchen if you need me." When Laura walked away, Daniel took a deep breath and carefully broke the seal of the envelope. A subtle scent escaped the paper. Lavender, the same scent that had always been present in Helena's hair and clothes. He felt his heart tighten even more. With trembling hands, he pulled the folded pages inside the envelope and unfolded them. Helena's delicate handwriting filled the lines. He recognized the loving way she always began her letters and notes. But this time, something was different. Helena wasn't just writing to him. She was saying goodbye. My love, if you're reading this letter, it's because I'm no longer there to hold your hand. Daniel felt his stomach churn. A silent tear ran down his face, and then he continued reading. Daniel squeezed his eyes shut, trying to hold back the tears. The simple fact of seeing Helena's handwriting, of smelling her perfume on the paper, made her absence seem even more painful. He took a deep breath and continued reading. My love, if you're reading this letter, it's because I'm no longer there to hold your hand. I know the pain is consuming you, and I'm sorry for that. I want to hug you one last time to tell you that everything will be okay. But, above all, I need to tell you something that I never had the courage to say in life. Daniel frowned. What did Helena want to tell him? He ran his hand over his face, feeling his heart beat faster. Before I met you, I went through difficult times. I always tried to protect you from that part of my life because I was afraid. Afraid that you would look at me differently. Afraid that this past would tarnish the love we built together. But now, with me gone, I realized that hiding this from you was a mistake. Daniel's chest tightened. He tried to imagine what Helena was talking about, but nothing made sense. She had always been a transparent, determined woman, someone who was never afraid to face life head-on. But then he kept reading. My childhood was difficult, Daniel. I grew up in a home where love and security were scarce. My mother did her best to keep us going, but we often went hungry. I saw firsthand the despair of not having enough to eat, of not knowing if we would have a roof over our heads the following month. That fear never completely left me. Daniel felt a lump in his throat. Helena never spoke about it. He knew she had not had an easy life, but he never knew how deep that scar was. When I was young, I made choices that I would never have liked to make. Choices that left scars on me, but that, at the time, seemed like the only way out. I don't want you to see me in a different light, just to understand that I did what I had to do to survive. Please try to forgive me if this secret hurts you. Daniel felt a shiver run through his body. His hands were shaking, his eyes burning. What was Helena trying to tell him? He swallowed hard and turned the page. He was about to find out. Daniel's hands were shaking. He turned the page of the letter carefully, as if the paper was as fragile as his heart at that moment. With each line, he felt like he was getting to know Helena in a completely new way. Daniel, my love, I know you must be confused right now. I know this secret can hurt you, but I need you to listen to me until the end. Before I met you, my life was very different. I carried a pain that I could never share with you, because I was afraid of losing the man I love. Daniel pressed his lips together. How could Helena think that anything she had done would make him love her less? While I was still very young, I got involved with someone who didn't love me. At first, I thought it was love, but I soon discovered that I was trapped in a toxic and abusive relationship. And then, when I thought I had suffered enough, I found out I was pregnant. Daniel's heart stopped for a moment. He blinked several times, trying to absorb that sentence. Pregnant? Helena had a child before she met him? He felt his chest tighten. He continued reading, without even noticing the tears that were starting to roll down his face. I wanted to be strong. I wanted to raise my daughter and give her everything I didn't have. But her father, was cruel. He humiliated me, accused me, said I was lying. And then, when I thought things couldn't get any worse, he abandoned me. Alone, with no money, no support, I didn't know what to do. I wanted so much to keep my baby with me, but the world seemed to conspire against it. In the end, I had to make the hardest decision of my life. Daniel felt short of breath. I gave my daughter up for adoption. He let the letter fall to the table. He brought his hands to his face, trying to process what he had just read. Helena had a daughter, and she had never told him. What else would that letter reveal? With his heart racing and his breathing heavy, he picked up the paper again and read the last sentence on the page. Her name is Isabel. Daniel reread that last sentence countless times. The name echoed in his mind like thunder. Isabel, the daughter Helena had hidden from him for all these years. He felt a whirlwind of emotions. Why had she never told him? Why had she kept this to the end? The pain of the revelation mixed with an unexpected feeling, an uncontrollable desire to find this girl. Taking a deep breath, he continued reading. I never stopped thinking about her, Daniel. Every day, I wondered where she was, what her face looked like if she was okay. But I was also afraid to look for her and, deep down, discover that she was better off without me. And, most of all, afraid that you would see me differently when you found out. Daniel squeezed his eyes shut, feeling his throat burn. How could she think he would judge her? All he felt at that moment was a deep desire to hug her, to tell her that she didn't have to carry this weight alone. But now it was too late. He folded the letter slowly, taking a deep breath. His mind was working fast. What to do? Helena's voice still seemed to echo in his mind. He knew she hadn't written that to force him to make any decisions, but to give him the chance to know the truth. He needed to find her. He stood up from his chair suddenly. He felt restless, as if every second wasted was less time to find out who Isabel was. He picked up the phone and dialed Laura's number. Her mother-in-law answered almost immediately. Daniel, is everything okay? He took a deep breath. I need to talk to you. It's urgent. A short time later, Laura was there, sitting on the couch, holding the letter with teary eyes. She finished reading it and looked at him, a lump in her throat. I didn't know that. Helena never told me. Daniel rubbed his face, emotionally exhausted. What do I do, Laura? I feel like I need to find her. She nodded slowly. If that's how you feel, then go find her. Daniel stood up, feeling a different weight in his chest. A purpose. He didn't know what he would find, but he knew he had to try. And tomorrow, he would begin his search for Isabel. That night, Daniel could barely sleep. His mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. The name Isabel echoed in his head, mixed with Helena's face and the words in that letter. In the morning, before the sun even rose, he was already up and researching everything he could about adoptions at the time Helena gave up her daughter. He didn't know where to start, but one thing was certain. He wouldn't give up. After hours of calling and searching the internet, he finally found a familiar name, Orfanato Esperanza. The place was still in operation and had old records. Wasting no time, he grabbed the car keys and drove there. When he arrived, he was greeted by a man with a deep voice and kind eyes. Good morning, sir. How can I help you? The man asked, identifying himself as Augusto, the person in charge of the orphanage. Daniel took a deep breath. I'm looking for someone. Isabel. I think she might have been adopted a few years ago. Augusto frowned and asked for a few minutes. He walked to a back room and came back with an old folder. He flipped through the papers for a moment, then looked at Daniel. Isabel, yes, we have records of her here. But it seems that he hesitated, adjusting his glasses. She was never adopted. Daniel's heart raced. What do you mean? She's still here. The man nodded. Yes, Isabel grew up in this orphanage. She's 12 years old now. The news hit Daniel like a shock. His daughter, Helena's daughter, had been there in that very building, waiting for a family for years. He felt a lump in his throat. Can I see her? Augusto hesitated for a moment, but then nodded. Come with me. They walked down a long hallway to a small courtyard. There, sitting under the shade of a tree, a little girl was playing by herself, drawing in a colorful notebook. Her brown hair blew in the wind, and her focused gaze exactly resembled Helena's. Daniel felt his heart stop. Isabel. The girl looked up at him. Who are you? He tried to swallow his emotion and approached, bending down to her level. My name is Daniel. I knew your mother. The girl's eyes lit up for a moment. My mother. Daniel smiled softly. Yes, and I think we have a lot to talk about. Isabel continued to look at Daniel with a mixture of curiosity and caution. He felt his heart racing, unsure of how this conversation would go. How could he tell her that his biological mother loved her more than anything, but that she never had the courage to look for her? The girl clutched the pencil in her hands and asked, her voice hesitant, Did you know my mother? Daniel took a deep breath. Yes. Her name was Helena. She was an incredible woman, strong, kind, and she thought of you every day of her life. Isabel's eyes lit up for a moment, but her expression soon closed. If she thought of me so much, why didn't she ever come get me? The question was like a knife in Daniel's chest. He felt a lump in his throat because he knew there was no easy answer. She was very afraid, Isabel, afraid of not being enough for you, afraid that you would be better off without her. But that never meant she didn't love you. The girl looked down, playing with the tip of her pencil. Daniel could tell she was trying to hide her emotion, but there was a different sparkle in her eyes. Did she leave something for me? Daniel swallowed hard. Not exactly, but I'm here. If you want, I can tell you everything about her. Who she was, what her smile was like, the funny stories she told. Isabel's eyes lit up a little. I'd like that. From that day on, Daniel started visiting the orphanage often. He brought books, sweets, and sat down to tell her everything about Helena. With each story, he saw Isabel smile a little wider, as if she was finally discovering the mother she never knew. One night, as he walked her back to the dormitory, Isabel grabbed the sleeve of his jacket. Daniel, yes? She bit her lip and hesitated. Do you think that someday I could have a family? Daniel felt his chest tighten. At that moment, he knew the answer. Isabel, you already have one. The next day, he started the adoption process. It took months of bureaucracy, interviews, and paperwork, but he didn't give up. Every signature, every meeting, every wait was worth it. And then, one day, the time finally came for Isabel to leave the orphanage and go home. When they walked into Daniel's house together, the girl looked around and took a deep breath. It feels like home. Daniel smiled and put his hand on her shoulder. Because it is. Time passed. The pain of losing Helena never completely disappeared, but little by little, it turned into longing. Daniel learned that life was not just about mourning, but also about hope. And every week, father and daughter went to the cemetery, where they left flowers on Helena's grave. On one of these visits, Isabel held a small bouquet and looked at Daniel. What do you think she was really like? He smiled, his eyes filling with tears. She was one of the most amazing people I've ever met. And I think you inherited her generous heart. Isabel smiled softly and placed the flowers in front of the headstone. In that moment, Daniel realized that Helena's love had never disappeared. It had simply found a new way to exist. And in that moment, he knew he was exactly where he was supposed to be,